You're listening to How to Stan, the podcast all about both specific fandoms and fan culture as a whole. New episodes are out every Sunday. Thank you for listening, and if you want more information about the show, visit 17kpop.weebly.com/how-to-stan.html. Again, that's 17kpop.weebly.com/how-to-stan.html. Thanks for listening. You're listening to How to Stan. This is episode 7, Comics and Superheroes. There are two key quotes that I want to highlight from this book called The 10-Cent Plague, The Great Comic Book Scare and How It Changed America by David Hajdu. The first quote is, "The comic book war was one of the first and hardest fought conflicts between young people and their parents in America, and it seems clear too now that it was worth the fight." The second quote, "Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry added the soundtrack to a scene created in comic books." So what those quotes basically sum up are a huge cultural marker in American history. If you look at a timeline of pop culture events and how they define different decades in American history, they are defined by the music that was popular and by the literature. And so that combination forms the musical movie of sorts, the soundtrack of people's lives that becomes so definitive and impressionable in forming American pop culture and how America is seen and how Americans are influenced forevermore. And so it truly changes the course of history, these pop culture milestones. And so in the 40s and 50s particularly, comic books were very much talked about in positive and negative lights as defining parts of those eras. And we're going to talk about the roots of those comic book popularity stories today. And we are going to talk about the comic book popularity that formed in the 40s and 50s today. There was a lot of backlash to comic book popularity, and that was because they were viewed as not a legitimate form of literature, that they were tainting kids' brains. It was kind of like the crusade against video games that would come decades later, where they were just worried about the lack of oversight over what kind of violent content could be in comic books. They didn't really have a regulatory board or anything at first. And in general, at the time, there were just a lot of moral panics and the sense of needing to censor content. So this backlash took many forms, one of them being school-led, sometimes, book burnings of these comics. In addition to the book burnings, there were a lot of fear-mongering headlines in the press, a lot of news stories warning about the dangers of these comics. And then there were hundreds of legislative proposals that were brought before Congress to regulate comic book content. There was a sudden fear that there wasn't being enough done legislatively to protect the children. And so this did start in as early as 1940 when comics were really still not super popular, and there wasn't much of a variety of comics to even choose from to read, but the fight had already started against them. As early as 1940, in December of that year, there was this article published called An Antidote to the Comic Magazine Poison, and that was in the National Educational Association Journal. There were many others like that viewed comics as poisoning the minds of the youth. So why was there so much fear surrounding comic book content, and how did comic book readers resist the fear-mongering attempts and really come out improving, if anything, the popularity of comics? How did it really define the youth of that era, and who is responsible for the negative reputation that comics got? We're going to talk about all of that and a lot more today. And we have to start any comic book moral panic related discussion with talking about Frederick Wertham. And like I just said, this was a thing before he really started railing against it. So he gets credited a lot with causing all of the moral panic against comic books, but actually it had started before him. But he really set a lot more wheels in motion and exacerbated pre-existing fears surrounding comic content and its impact on kids. So he's definitely treated as a villain in the minds of comic book fans for his negative influence and bashing of comic books over time that ended up making it into the halls of Congress because of how vehemently he was opposed to comics. So Wertham was a psychiatrist from Germany, but he was invited to work in the USA starting in 1922. He joined the psychiatric clinic at Phipps Hospital and Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. He also became a senior psychiatrist for the New York City Department of Hospitals. He was the director of mental hygiene clinics at Bellevue Hospital and Queens General Hospital. And he really overall just had a lot of high credentials and respect in the psychiatric community. Some of his writings ended up actually being used in huge, well-known cases, one of the most famous, of course, being Brown v. Board. Brown versus Board of Education is the USA Supreme Court case that desegregated schools, that determined segregated schools were unconstitutional, and he had written an argument saying that it was harmful to kids' mental health if they grew up with segregated schooling, and so he helped Brown v. Board pass with that argument. And he also contributed to other arguments over time in court. He talked about and defended the Brooklyn Vampire, this notorious criminal, in 1936. He released a book called The Brain is an Organ, where he talked about his findings about brain physiology that was very well received and admired in the medical community. That was in 1934. He also became known yet again for another landmark decision that he had an impact on, where he, in 1941, reinterpreted a currently existing graphic. So there was this visual test used to test someone for having schizophrenia, and he reinterpreted what that visual should look like to better identify who had schizophrenia. And so he continued to have a huge impact on how mental health was perceived and defined in the USA, particularly in the court system. He actually worked in a New York City court that was considered the first of its kind, where all convicted felons were they were all required to receive a psychiatric evaluation, and so he would be the person to carry out those evaluations. He was a psychiatrist who frequently worked with juvenile delinquents, and he noticed a pattern among the juvenile delinquents that he talked to. A lot of them talked about how they liked to read comic books. That was a pastime of theirs. And so that really got him thinking about a possible link between comic book reading and being delinquent. And he published all of these musings in a really history-altering book in 1954 called Seduction of the Innocent, which is a book that argued all against everything related to comic books, talking about how they would damage kids' minds, and tried to draw this direct link between reading comics and committing crimes. His railings against comic books can basically be summed up in 5 categories. 1, he thought comic books were just way too violent. 2, he worried that they were a negative overall impact on kids because what they were seeing would get into their psyche, and then if they committed immoral acts later in life or said immoral things, that would be because of how comic books influenced their thinking. So he would credit comic books with he was saying comic books are to blame for kids' bad behavior, basically. 3, he tried to somehow link reading comics to illiteracy, and that was really feeding into a lot of concerned parents' fears at the time that it wasn't a legitimate thing to be reading and it wasn't good for kids' just educational growth. It was viewed as not the brightest thing to read, not the most intellectually stimulating, but we're going to get to why that's a problematic viewpoint in a minute. But number 4, he somehow linked Superman to promoting fascism in some way. That's a whole thing. And number 5, he really went on this homophobic agenda, really. Some argue he didn't, and that it was really just in general, he didn't want any sexual relationship alluded to in any way in comics. He didn't want kids exposed to any of that, but some say that he really did hold a grudge against comic books, like with Batman and Robin. He viewed them as lovers, and he definitely looked down upon that relationship, and so his arguments are interpreted in different ways there, but he did rail against any hints at romantic or sexual relationships in comics. So there were a lot of issues, not just one specific category of problems that he found with these comics. So Wortham found the ability through this book, Seduction of the Innocent, to really tap into and exacerbate pre-existing fears among concerned parents, teachers, etc. about the impact that comic books, especially violent comic books, were having on kids' minds. And so he was able to channel their concern into these tangible, concrete arguments that he would voice and try to demonstrate in court. So he actually triggered a set of legislative hearings on comic books and if they should be censored or not, and all about his book, really. So the trial was all about what the comic book impact on kids was and if they could really prove that there was that direct correlation between committing crimes and reading comic books. So a congressional inquiry was launched in a juvenile delinquency subcommittee in the USA, and it became a nationwide televised event, these hearings that really gained the nation's attention. And his arguments were even used for political ends. So, for example, there was this one senator who basically used Wortham to advance a personal agenda, although it was interesting because all interest in Wortham's writings seemed to disappear once that senator secured a Senate position, so it was kind of an electoral move and nothing else. Fun fact, one comic publisher actually got so nervous as these hearings went on, and he was worried that this was the end of the comic book industry as we know it, that this comic publisher basically cut his losses and created these rules that banned his own comics, and by doing so, he basically disavowed his old work and then moved on to focusing on a spoof comic series instead that would kind of, be guaranteed the ability to stay in circulation because of parody protections and whatnot. And so he started channeling all his energy into his spoof comic series that used to be a side project for him, which eventually turned into what is now known as Mad Magazine. So that's an interesting side story. But anyway, so in 1954, after these hearings, what was triggered was the creation of this Comics Code Authority, which was basically a self-censoring group of comic book publishers. These hearings were a big flop. It's not like they led to any criminal charges or anything, or any actual crackdowns on what was already in circulation, but it did affect what future releases would look like, because people had gotten so shaken up by those hearings and were worried that if they crossed a line, no matter how arbitrary the line was defined, they would be out of business. And so a lot of self-censoring started happening out of fear of going out of business or being dragged into future court hearings. So the launch of Comics Code Authority took place in 1954. And Comics Code Authority was basically a group of publishers who came together to self-censor. They set their own censorship guidelines and decided they were going to hold each other accountable for making sure they didn't cross those new lines they had established for themselves. They did have more direct and less just vague ways to censor themselves. For example, certain words like terror, they just banned from their books entirely. Certain graphic depictions they weren't allowed to project in their drawings, like any injury to the eye. So yeah, some vagueness there still, but also they tried to be a little more specific now after the hearings with what could be wrong and what could cause a ban on their comics if they didn't self-censor it. So this really didn't have, it had clout publicly, but not clout in terms of like the law, because if you violated one of these self-censorship standards, it wasn't technically illegal, but at the same time, if you didn't abide by these new guidelines by this Comics Code Authority group, in the public eye, you were really looked at with scorn if you weren't abiding by the same standards that others were holding themselves to. Suddenly, the bar had been raised regarding this perceived morality of your content. After those hearings, the following summer, the threat of going out of business if you didn't follow the guidelines became extra real, because the summer after the hearings, 15 different comic publishers entirely went out of business. So it was sink or swim time. And the ones who were authorized by the CCA, the Comics Code Authority, could have a label on their comic saying so. So it was basically this group became like the parental advisory sticker issuers of the comics world. And so that gave parents some reassurance when they were in the store that they could buy their kids that comic if it had that sticker. So it did affect profits. Marvel and DC did both voluntarily comply with the new code, which is one of the many reasons why they were able to maintain their longevity. This Comics Code Authority was new for the USA, but not elsewhere in the world. In 1948, this Dutch minister, Theo Rutten, he wrote this letter insisting that comics had no educational value, and he wrote this op-ed in a newspaper basically arguing that comics should be banned from schools. This discussion was also taking place in France, who in 1949 passed a law. Literally, the law translation is Law of July 16th, 1949, on publications aimed at youth. And other comic restrictions took place in Germany in 1955, where they established this similar organization that they called Voluntary Self-Control for Comics. It's important to keep in mind, though, that these groups were not all a product of Wortham's hearings. They were happening around the world, these conversations, beforehand and afterwards. But he's definitely treated as this bogeyman among comics fans for leading to all the self-censorship. Now, years later, suddenly all of these truths came out about Wortham's work and all of the ways that he had led readers astray with it. In Wortham's book, he violated a whole bunch of expectations that you're supposed to hold yourself to as a social researcher when you're publishing research. He did not meet journalistic standards in any way with this book, Seduction of the Innocent. First of all, he used a non-representative sample, so you can't, in sociology and psychology, psychiatry, whatever, in these fields, you cannot publish research that describes something that happened to one small group of people as descriptive of a whole group of people. You have to be very specific in how you write your research conclusions. So, for example, if there was a group of, well, let's just use this as an example. So, with these comic book readers, he could have said juvenile delinquents in New York City more often than not read comic books. And there may be a correlation between their delinquency and the comic reading. He may not actually have been able to say that last part, because that was still quite misleading and not accurate, but you get the point. Whereas for what he tried to say, that's what he should have said. What he tried to say, though, is that he implied that juvenile delinquents are always reading comic books, or comic books directly cause juvenile delinquency. He didn't specify that he was talking to a certain subgroup of the population, and that subgroup was not even representative of just juveniles overall. So basically, it would be like talking about what causes murders, but you only interviewed a bunch of accused or convicted murderers, and then saying, well, the murderers seem to all show that the whole population just really loves these certain types of books or whatever, and that has led to this subset of the population murdering people. That's a weird example, but you know what I mean. So he also did not acknowledge his conflicts of interest in the people he spoke with. For example, he did seem to have that personal agenda against Batman and Robin. He had a specific hatred that was extra for them for some reason. And so that you would, in really credible, trustworthy research, you would acknowledge, full disclosure, these findings factor in my bias against this specific comic book that was talked about by the subjects I interviewed, or something like that. But he did not disclose that in this book. He also combined quotes from different people he interviewed, or just wrote them and paraphrased them in very misleading ways. He would replace certain words that made a big impact, like sometimes he would replace the word sometimes with often. So if someone said during an interview to him, sometimes I read comic books, he would say, here is this accused killer who often reads comic books, which has an entirely different weight to it to say. So he would totally misrepresent the picture. He had a non-representative sample. His writing was not neutral. It was clearly to advance his agenda. He would also imply things without clarifying. So he described things like the Blue Beetle, for example. And if you were not a comic fan and you were just reading this research, if you were like a concerned parent maybe reading this book and you didn't know much about the comics your kid was reading, when he talks about this blue beetle, you might have thought that it was literally him talking about an actually lethal beetle that was being a part of the plot point in these books, when actually the Blue Beetle was a name for a human character, but you wouldn't know that. Now, does that detail matter? On its own, maybe not, but the point is that those little distinctions that you don't clarify in a study really add up and really should take a toll on someone's credibility as a researcher. So, fact-checking in even those little ways and clarifying what you mean is so important, and he did not do that here. He also seemed to give certain superheroes and the statements made about them more weight than other superheroes. He over-exaggerated some content. For example, there's one scene where one superhero's head is off, kind of, where basically invisible spray was used and so his head is missing in the image, but he described it in the book as the man was beheaded or decapitated, or he used some word like that. And so he would exaggerate things like that to make them sound more gory than they were. He was also considered an unreliable narrator in other instances, so he did not maintain his sterling reputation from previous years before his comic crusade, and that continued. For example, he wrote this story called Dark Legend, and that was just an example of one of the many stories he wrote that was praised in literary circles, so it gave him the air of, or the false air of credibility among some circles of well-respected scholars, but those were literary scholars. His books were not received the same way by psychiatric circles of people. So he had some very key, noteworthy, and credible rulings and publications in medical journals, but then things really took a turn towards the conspiratorial and misleading after he started his comic crusade. There is this book called Seducing the Innocent, Frank Wortham and the Falsifications That Helped Condemn Comics by Carol Tilly, a library scientist. She basically sums it up as saying that Wortham, quote, manipulated, overstated, compromised, and fabricated evidence for the books. And that basically sums it all up. He may have known himself what he was doing, because you could say that maybe he had really tricked himself or really genuinely thought that comics were linked to delinquency. But if that were the case, I don't know if he would have gotten the other prominent awards that he had gotten by that time. He was smart enough to know what he was doing and how it was misleading. And so he even said in the Seduction of the Innocent book that comics are, quote, pictures within pictures for those who know how to look, implying there that his conclusions were up to interpretation, which is not how research should work. You should be the one interpreting. That's the point of research. But that's what he did. So there were a lot of instances where he proved to be an unreliable narrator when talking about this specific topic. So what he did and its lasting impact can be measured in a few different ways, and one is by looking at the content of comics going forward. There was the Silver Age of comics, it was called. It was an era approximately 1956 to 1979, and this era was basically what followed the Comics Code Authority's creation, when the comic book industry had this massive moment of realization that they would have to totally rebrand in the wake of the hearings. Even though the hearings turned up nothing and were pretty much a waste of time and taxpayer resources, but I digress. So the Silver Age is what came next, where publishers were basically forced to be more creative, and it was viewed as this cleaned up era for comics where they were self-censoring, and that was viewed by the public as pretty good for them to do, and realized that they had to keep themselves in check. It also became a time when many superhero-themed comics were on the rise of popularity, so it was considered the Silver Age of comics. And a lot more variety of comics were available for reading then. Despite the possibly embarrassing trial that didn't turn up anything, Wortham did not actually disappear from the spotlight after that public relations disaster of a situation. He came back to publishing, and in 1973 he published The World of Fanzines, which took quite a new turn, where he actually talked about fandoms in a very positive light. You would think that he would continue to be very negative in his reporting and understanding of fandom culture, but he seemed to suddenly have turned over a new leaf, and he wrote this pretty well-received piece called The World of Fanzines, talking about these fan-made magazines that were like the original fandom Twitter accounts and group chats and things like that. So he really actually did think of fandoms as not being this totally dangerous or waste of time situation. He really viewed being a part of this fanzine creation as a great and healthy creative outlet for your passion, for your emotion, for your sense of community. And he even in this book mentioned some of the pros of comic books. He wasn't suddenly in full-throated defense of comics. He never came around in that way, but he did it to an extent allow for admitting to himself that yes, comics do have some merit and value just in terms of kids' mental health. It's not all negative. It's a way to connect with other readers and to feel like you're all a part of enjoying the same story. So the Comics Code Authority was pretty much abandoned by 2011, but some comics maybe still self-censor, but for the most part it's pretty free reign these days. And ironically, Wortham became this ultimate scapegoat for angry comic fans, but some argue that he kind of also deserves credit for what comics are today. Some people say he deserves credit for what comics are today, and that's a bad thing, and others say it in a positive tone because he's responsible for the good and the bad. He ultimately reshaped how comics were viewed in America for better and for worse. And so the evolution of comics, the requirements for comic book creators to be more creative than ever and to interact with other comic publishers to figure out what standards they would set for themselves if they were on the same page, the collaboration the community created, the defensiveness fans grew to have when their favorite books were talked about in court hearings and stuff, the passion that he helped provoke, both the negative and positive emotions, but ultimately the passion he provoked in comic fans really did change the course of comic book history, and ironically kind of legitimized and insisted upon the constant presence of a comic book fandom. So that continued over time, and then these fans over time, of course, really made their love for comics more well-known in the public spheres with going to conventions and things like that. There also became the growth of graphic novels. So we're going to talk about graphic novels and the history of these fan conventions after the break. In addition to the comic book format, there are two other main ways that fans of comic book characters have really been able to show their love and appreciation for those characters and just continued to embrace this passion they have for those stories. One is through reading and sharing graphic novels, and the other is through going to actual physical fan conventions. So first of all, let's talk about a brief history of how graphic novels came about and what makes them different from comics. So the 1920s is when comic strips started appearing in newspapers like Joe Palooka and Mutt and Jeff, and more original comic storytelling really came about in the 30s though, and then really rose to prominence in the 40s and 50s. Although the term graphic novel wasn't actually noted as being used before 1964. When Richard Kyle started using it, he wrote an article about the future of comics, and in this piece about the future of comics, he used both the phrase graphic story and the phrase graphic novel when describing what he predicted comics would look like going forward. Actually, Richard Kyle also kind of made that a thing by his own efforts because he worked on making this fanzine called Graphic Story Magazine, so he really helped popularize the term, but it didn't take off instantly. It was not an overnight success to popularize the term because it was used very sporadically, the term graphic novel, in the 70s and 80s with a very arbitrarily applied definition. But then in the 80s, in the early 80s, graphic novels became this verifiably distinguished category from a traditional comic book. This was really spurred by the release of a series called The Death of Captain Marvel, which started being published for $4.95 a copy, which was way more expensive than your average comic book for the time. So the popularity of the phrase graphic novel really shot up due to The Death of Captain Marvel being considered a graphic novel separate from your traditional comic book purchase in terms of the length of the story and the price of it. And then really entered the lexicon of comic fans officially when DC released collections of comics in book form. They released a Watchmen collection and a Dark Knight Rises collection. At first, it was very seemingly randomly applied to describe what was a graphic novel versus a comic, but some overall broad standards that seem to be pretty solidified right now that show the actual ways to distinguish between comics and graphic novels. First of all, comics are released regularly, typically. So there's always a new installment, and it picks up where the last comic left off. So every comic tends to end on a cliffhanger for the next installment of the ongoing storyline that is spread out across each comic. Whereas a graphic novel is a lot more condensed. It's a beginning, middle, and end in itself. Sort of like a season of a TV show where each season of the show will have the same characters and some broader thematic continuations, but for the most part you can just watch a season of a show on its own, and it still is understandable. You get what's going on, and there are some unique plot lines and stuff for that season, so there's enough material there where you have a grasp on the material without watching the entire series all through. Also, comic books have typically been much cheaper and much shorter. The average comic book length is about 22 pages. Graphic novels are the length of a novel, so much bigger and more expensive. They tend to look more glossy and well made, easy to, traditional comic books may have been a little flimsy with the paper and they could fall apart easily, and graphic novels looked a lot more polished. Another key difference is that comics have traditionally been made with a different illustrator and author. So the author works with the illustrator, but they have their own parts of creating the final product. Whereas graphic novels, much more often for graphic novels than for comics, there's one person directing it all, the illustrations, the writing, all of that. Also, superheroes and sci-fi stories tend to stick to the realm of comics more, and if you're talking about like autobiographical works or other non-fiction stories, those tend to be told in graphic novel form instead. But like I said before, there are a lot of pieces of work that kind of toe the line between comic versus graphic novel. All to say that the fans of comic books and fans of graphic novels are not necessarily distinct fandoms from each other. Graphic novels just became a somewhat new format to embrace this form of storytelling. The second way that fans have found this other physical manifestation of character storyline and the continuation of it, and a way to preserve their passion for it through this relic of pop culture, essentially, is by attending these physical conventions for their favorite characters. The term fan convention actually was originally used in the context of sports fans meeting up, but over time the term convention became more and more often associated with pop culture fan meetups instead, and now is pretty much exclusively referred to for pop culture purposes. The first real con was Worldcon, which was for Star Trek. More on that in a future episode. So Comic-Con became one of the most well-known ones after Worldcon, and now averages around 130,000 attendees every year. The first Comic-Con was held in a hotel in San Diego in 1970. There were some exhibition-style events, fan art, and things like that on display. It was a place to really highlight indie writers and more under-the-radar comic creators and sci-fi novelists. The focus was on those underdog stars, and about 300 people attended. Quickly after that, though, instead of staying in a hotel room, it moved to the San Diego Convention Center, and it went from 300 attendees to having 123,000 attendees, and then it's only grown more since then, even expanding internationally. There is also a London Comic-Con every year that draws tens of thousands of attendees. And that traditional feel of the first Comic-Cons is pretty much gone, seems to be the consensus among newer attendees who have been going since the beginning, or at least earlier on in its history. So they've never really shied away with Comic-Con of being transparent about their purpose and how they are working the system in a way, because over time, the realization dawned on Comic-Con that this was a huge marketing opportunity here, especially with the rise of social media, that if they dropped huge news related to the superhero world at Comic-Con, if they had breaking news stories, if they had very, very shareable social media content and funny moments and things like that, if they had celebrity appearances, there were all sorts of ways they knew they could bring more eyes to this event, which would then, in turn, bring more ideal customers and viewers and things like that. So Over 20 cable networks were already in attendance at Comic-Con to report on the event by 2013, and I'm sure the number only grew after that. So a lot of media attention suddenly came to Comic-Con every year, which really altered the landscape of the event. So it went from being very focused on under-the-radar artists and really for the super fans to being a commercialized event that intended to get mass appeal. So as opposed to being a fringe event for this small subset, this small subculture of sorts, it really became what some people frankly call a sellout event, where people were no longer attending Comic-Con because they were a true diehard fan. Now even the more casual fans were attending, or people who didn't know much about the superheroes but really wanted to see Robert Downey Jr. live or something like that. And so the big budget names kept coming in, which really altered how the event looked. Not to say that everyone was disappointed by this, but the general character of the event changed over time, which was cited frequently as a source of disappointment in interviews over the years with Comic-Con attendees. For example, there is this study that compared the experiences of fans in San Diego Comic-Con to those in London's Comic-Con. This was done by the University of Wolverhampton. They used a mixed methods approach with tag clouds to see how often certain words showed up in survey questionnaire answers and things like that. We won't get into all the sociological background. I'll post the full study on my show's site so you can really get into it if you want to. But for now, I will just say that it compared 57 responses from London and 51 from the San Diego event and looked at what those attendees said about the events. All those participants had attended Comic-Con within the past 3 years and were all ages 19 and up. So keep in mind those qualifiers and the stipulations surrounding this data and how much you can or cannot generalize it, but I do still find the findings quite illuminating and they may speak to larger thoughts voiced by more fans who were not surveyed too. So the San Diego fans tended to put a lot more emphasis when asked why they were attending and what excited them about attending on the celeb cameos and the breaking news that tends to happen, which makes sense given its proximity to Hollywood, at least compared to the London Comic-Con. San Diego fans were also much more likely to report that they were interested in cosplaying while they were there, so that is an interesting cultural difference that I would love to explore more in future research. The most often cited sources of motivation to attend this event were seeing friends there and meeting up with other fans, seeing the celebrities, and the relatively reasonable price in their minds. The most often cited annoyances with this event were long lines and overcrowding. They tended to complain most about the fact this event had gotten so big. So some of them it was just a logistics frustration with when there are more people, it's harder to get a good view of events and rooms get more packed and all of that. But others seem to truly feel disillusioned by not just being in a room with other diehard fans, but now it was fans of all levels of passion mixed together and rubbed some of them the wrong way. The most often used words in answers about how Comic-Con has changed over time were cost, less authentic, and busier. So cost, meaning literally how much you pay to get in, has changed. That's no surprise. Busier, that makes sense. And then less authentic was the one that really stood out to me. Like they felt like the true ethos behind Comic-Con and its purpose for being created to shine a light on certain creators was kind of being totally manipulated and changed over time. The most often used words when asked how they would try to convince one of their friends to go to this event with them: awesome, celebrities, indie, meet and greet, and cheap. So again, apparently it's, worth your money to go to this event, and some of them do cite celebrities as being a great way to pull in more fans and convince them to go with you, but others prefer to use words like indie, which is interesting, how they want to view it as some want to market this event as, hey, you want to come because this is an exclusive club to be a part of, whereas others were saying that they were going to convince their friend to go with by saying, this is super inclusive and everyone's welcome and you're going to love it because who doesn't love this mega celebrity that's attending? So very interesting, different reflections on the experience. And that is the community, the collective experience. Let's look at on an individual level what these conventions do for people. So there is a research study that was conducted by a pop culture anthropologist named Daryl G. Frazzetti. This study I will also publish on my site after this episode drops. His work mixed in-person interviews from 2016 to 2018 with some other data collection and observations about attending Comic-Con as a Batman fan. So this focused exclusively on Batman fans and their interview responses, and I found them very illuminating. So, first of all, 20% of the fans surveyed consider themselves to be professional fans, and he defined professional fans for the study as, quote, they run fan films, produce and sell fan art, run social media sites for various actors, are convention merch designers, or well-versed in the overall mythology / characters / storylines across the franchise. So I was a bit surprised by that thought. More would consider themselves professional fans. 60% considered themselves moderate fans. Only 2% considered themselves major prop or merch collectors, which I also found a bit shocking. And only 1% commented that their fandom involvement had declined as they got older. So these are some interesting new trends that may have to do with social media, because I would argue that probably a higher percent of fans tried to show off their fandom affiliation in the past with merch collecting. It was probably higher than 2%. And now that they have social media to show off all of their extreme dedication to their fandom, they feel less of a need to prove their fandom status through physical objects that they own. That would be my guess. The other thing with social media is that the longevity can be there. So even if you feel judged and stereotyped and that scares you out of continuing to go to Comic-Con because you think you're too old for it or whatever, you don't have to. Your age means nothing if you're just talking to other fans online, and so maybe that has also increased the amount of people who don't feel the need to leave a fandom when they're quote-unquote too old. So only 1% said that they felt like age caused them to drift away from the fandom. And everyone, interestingly, seemed to assume that other fans were more of a fan than them, though. So basically, they seemed to be modest about how much knowledge they had about Batman. Maybe they were scared that he would ask them gotcha questions on the spot during the interview, and so they didn't want to act like they were the know-it-all of Batman knowledge or something. But it's also interesting because the 60% who call themselves moderate fans, I wonder what percent they would call themselves that just when not being interviewed, just in their daily life. Maybe they would be more likely to say, actually, yeah, I'll be honest, I'm a 90% professional fan or something like that. I don't know. The next question was, why do you participate in fandom culture? And a lot of them pointed out that they participate in the Batman fandom because he's a relatable figure, and channeling Batman is something that can really help them spread good values to others. Some key quotes that really stood out to me in their responses. One is, I reside in Texas and cosplay as Batman for juvenile facilities. I try to give them a positive role model to look to in order to instill hope for them and teach them that they can change their lives for the better. Who doesn't love Batman? Another quote, I'm a third grade teacher in Atlanta. My husband dresses as Batman and provides talks for our school twice a year and at our community center twice a year on bullying. So Batman is kind of used as this figure to get little kids to listen to your important PSAs, essentially. When asked, how do you express your fan interest? 65% said that they collect and display their merch. 15% said they cosplay. 10% weren't sure how to answer. 5% said that they show their fan interest through fan fiction or fan art creation. And 2% said they make YouTube videos related to the Batman fandom. This I find extra interesting because I would assume the percents would have been much higher for fan fiction writing and YouTube commentary. So that is an interesting distinction between modern day Batman fans and modern day fans of other things, musicians, for example, who seem to be very online. The next question, how, if at all, has Batman influenced you on a personal level? 94% talked about how their relationships were influenced. So how they form new friendships at the convention, or just form friendships bonding over loving Batman, or even some people have met the loves of their life while attending a convention, because if geographic issues prevented you from meeting them before, but you both flew into town for this convention, that is a way to meet with a love of your life potentially. So truly lifelong relationships can form at these conventions. Many talked about also in their answers how Batman shows you don't need superpowers to change the world, and so on a very personal level, it just led them to be introspective and kind of see their own superhero within themselves, because Batman is someone they can aspire to be like, because his outfit is the powers essentially. Without his suit and his gadgets, he wouldn't have the stereotypical definition of superpowers, but they would still consider him an iconic figure on his own, and so that is something relatable to them, at least compared to other superheroes. And this quote from the author of this study I found an incredibly accurate, succinct summary of the message he got from asking this question. The core ideological component to Batman is that of hope. Regardless of the political and social times, hope is a message that continually draws people into a story or character. Stories and characters may change with the times, but the core ideology is never truly altered. It adapts to the times. The ideological aspect of hope is a main driving force for attraction to a character, and a main driving force behind why so many will incorporate aspects of that character, consciously or not, into their own personas or daily lives. It is also why so many fans choose to cosplay as Batman. By engaging in such active participation, fans are becoming the hope, bringing that message, the myth, to their world, to mainstream culture. We will return to the significance of that quote later on, but let's talk about the next question. Has Batman influenced you in a professional/community way? Over 71% said Batman has influenced their career choice. Now, before you start thinking, whoa, does that mean they all decided to become crime fighters or something? Not necessarily that literally, but more indirectly, Batman's values that drive his decisions as a character also drove their motivation in ways that may not seem obvious on the surface, but just introspectively over time, Batman's influence spurred them to go down certain career paths that are not necessarily as literal as you may think. They all didn't decide to become Batman for a living, but for example, one person was quoted saying, "I use Batman comics, Adam West, and animated episodes to help at-risk youth." One person said, "As a counselor, I use the story of Bruce Wayne to help at a children's center for children who have had parents pass away." And another said, "I use the values of Batman to assist at a family shelter and help collect goods for the families that stay with us and to connect them with opportunities to help them rise up." Batman's overall giving spirit and what drives him to do good in the world is what also drove these people towards do-good focused jobs. How would you define the typical/average Batman fan? There was a lot of diversity in these answers, and that is very pleasing. It's nice to know that diversity is considered a big strength within this fandom, and I think that's part of the reason why Batman fans are still around after all this time, because there's constantly a new Batman movie out, and so there's constantly a way to introduce the next generation to this timeless hero. So if you grew up with Batman, your kid can also grow up with Batman, and not just that, but experience the same joy and excitement you did when you first saw a Batman movie that was brand new premiere. And now your kids can still see a new premiere too, because there's always a new one, it seems like. And so that's kind of part of the appeal of other superheroes too, is that it's something that over time, generation after generation in your family can learn to enjoy and can experience that joy of seeing certain superheroes on the big screen for the first time. Very interesting quote. This is certainly a fandom that can be said to be co-evolving with not only Batman, but also along with the other characters, including Gotham City itself. Gotham City, after all, is a reflection of reality and is itself a key character to the Batman story, to the stories of those lives it touches within fandom. When asked, do you have a preferred version of Batman given the numerous interpretations, interestingly, many indicated that their favorite version of Batman is just the one that got them hooked, that really drew them into the fandom and made them a more passionate, excited Batman fan. The original source of their love for this fandom membership is the Batman that they really stuck with over time, which I found very interesting because, again, it shows how generationally Batman can mean different things to different people, but at his core, he remains important to a lot of people as this cultural icon. That was further proven with the next question, which asked, what values do you see in Batman that may transcend cultures? And the main categories that the author summarized their answers as being in included these words: hope, justice, self-improvement, selflessness, discipline, knowledge, caring, confidence, and relatability. The next question, do you consider yourself a Batman purist or existentialist? A little over 84% said existentialist, not purist, meaning that they are very open to other interpretations of the Batman storyline and theories about what it all means and all these backstories potentially, all these suggestions fans have for how the story, what certain things in the story really mean or allude to. Over 84% are okay with more flexibility in those interpretations, which again helps with this fandom's longevity and seemingly lack of divisions within the fandom compared to other fandoms I've been researching. There seems to be a lot more inclusivity, or at least an embrace of different viewpoints, and just overall there seems to be quite a bit of diversity in every way in this fandom. 55.5% of the respondents are female, 44.4% male, and the pre-internet fandom, though, seems to be much more male, and then over time, more and more females have joined the fandom, or at least that's just how it looks. But again, as we've talked about on previous episodes of the show, the rise of fandoms online has really showed more and more female interest in fandom participation, because if they feel like they'd be very excluded going to an in-person event that was male-dominated and male-hosted, they have an alternative space to turn to show off their love and knowledge about a subject. Last question, when is a man a city and when is a city a man? This I found very interesting because, again, it talks about Batman and Gotham City being inextricably linked. Quote, the questions about this symbiotic relationship have made for some of the most complex and compelling stories throughout the history of Batman. Gotham City is also a living entity, a diverse character within the Batman universe. Just like any other character, the city also has a fan following. Gotham City could not exist without Batman. Batman could not exist without Gotham City. So what he's basically saying here is that you can take Batman out of Gotham City, but you can't take the Gotham City out of Batman. And that shows that is another reason why in one of my first episodes of this series, I talked about physical locations where fans can go to live out a certain scene from a show. Like, you can go to the certain settings to see the Friends couch, or go to the Britney Spears music video, pop-up exhibits, where you can just pose and take pictures in certain settings that recreate certain iconic pop culture rooms. And those settings, why they mean so much more than just physical objects that you take photos by. They're so much more than a photo op to people. Why those settings are so exciting for fans and make you a little starstruck sometimes to be in. This is part of that, because those settings become like characters of their own. They take on a life of their own. So you're not just going to sit on a couch. You are going to Friends. You're seeing the Friends characters as if you were, the couch is like another Friends character, if that makes sense. And so Gotham City is the same way, where the personal attachment fans feel to being invested in this story is not just toward the characters, but props and other aspects of the story that seem so important and essential for the canon that they also take on a life of their own that fans are protective over and want to be a part of defining and supporting over time. So my overall takeaways, as I was reading about and studying and looking at all of this activity surrounding superhero fandoms and comic book fandoms and all of that, there are three main categories my responses could be grouped into. Reason one why I think comic books and these superhero stories have withstood the test of time are that they are an emotional outlet. What can happen is when you look at these comic book stories and stuff, when they're banned or viewed as too violent, sometimes that just drives people to like them more, so it's that sense of rebelliousness. But it's not just that, it's also a bit cathartic to watch someone beat the bad guys, for the good guys to win, and just any force you're feeling when you get really angry and you just want to punch something, you can watch a superhero do it for you. And it feels like you can live vicariously through them in a way. And at a deeper level, it's a way to make sense of your feelings. And when you're really worked up about something and don't know how to articulate it, sometimes comics can do that for you in a new form, because when words kind of are failing you, maybe an image matched with a thought bubble will suffice. There is a book somewhat related to this thought by Gerard Jones. He's a former comic writer, and he's the author of this book called Killing Monsters: Why Children Need Fantasy Superheroes and Make-Believe Violence. He basically argues that quote-unquote violent media can actually help kids' behavioral and emotional development, if it is, of course, viewed at an age-appropriate level and all of that. So don't just let your kids watch anything, but what he's saying, though, is that people get a bit too worried and concerned about what kids see happening on their TV shows and in their cartoons and stuff, when really some of that is important for them to see, because it helps them learn how to verbalize stuff that words have been failing them to verbalize. Like when they get angry, they can actually see what anger looks like. When they get sad, they can see what some sad fury might look like, and things like that. And when they see those play out visually, it helps them attach words to those feelings, and it's a way to help kids process how they're feeling and see that it's normal. And it's a way, ultimately, what he argues is that it's just better than letting your kids' feelings fester and go unnamed and leave them confused and let them build up inside them until they erupt like a volcano with negative emotions. So just seeing it constantly can help regulate it and help them come to terms with it. A key quote from this author is, "It explodes tensions through emotional arousal and make-believe aggression. It provides corrective, happy endings that help children to believe that what frightens them can be overcome, and it allows them to manipulate troubling ideas until those ideas become familiar and lose their power." So that last part, becomes familiar and then loses its power, is really, really impactful and worth taking a minute to think about. Because, and before that, when he says it allows them to manipulate troubling ideas, because think about when kids are scared of the monster under their bed or something like that. It's the fear of the unknown. When the lights go out or something else happens that kids might get a little scared about. It's mostly the unknown, the fear that something is hiding, something's lurking and they don't know what it is. So if you clearly define it and point out what is there or is not there, it really eases their mind and comforts them. And so if you can do that with emotions too, it's like they have a monster under their bed, proverbially, but in their brain, until they can identify an emotion. So if they're able to take that scary concept and suddenly start imagining something more fun happening, or something good happening, that can really help them process those moments of fear. Ultimately, media can serve as this way for kids to feel a sense of control and power that can be very helpful and not harmful, because if they see certain emotions being carried out, it legitimizes their own emotions. It doesn't make them feel like life is all about just putting on a happy face. It shows an extreme range of emotions and validates feeling extreme emotions, and then they won't seem extreme, they'll be normalized. And it really ultimately goes down to kids feeling like they can reclaim some power, because they're at an age where their parents tell them what to do a lot. And so for them to feel like they can read something and understand it without their parents can really be a way to just boost their confidence. So that's one reason why I think comics have stood the test of time, is because they're an emotionally cathartic thing to watch. And this goes for all ages too, not just kids. Reason 2 is because they add some fun to people's lives simply. They're fun, they're enjoyable, they're entertaining, they're an escapist thing to dive into, the worlds of superheroes, and they're just a fun addition to monotonous days. They really, when the life is boring or just, monotonous, you can dive into a comic book world and add some suspense to your day and some action, where you can also feel comforted knowing that in this world you escape into, the good guys are going to win in the end of the day. Reason 3 is that these characters embody these universally applicable aspects of humanity that we should all strive to. Like I was saying before with the Batman responses, is that these superheroes represent not necessarily super specific things. It's not like Batman is known for representing yellow belts. He's known for representing the actual values that go into his decision to be Batman. There is a quote I would like to leave you all with today that really sums up my main arguments here. So Francisca Goldsmith, she is a library scientist who is a core collections advisor specializing in children's and graphic novels, and she said, quote, "Graphic novel readers," and she's also referring to comic readers here, "of any age, including the very youngest, are engaged in the reading process in a way that is more active than either reading print alone or watching videos. Because the panels in graphic novels are essentially static, yet following one upon the next in a specific order to suit the creator's story, the reader is the one to infer the action that must have occurred between the panels." And she goes on to talk more about that, but basically what it comes down to is that when people dismiss reading comics or graphic novels as not, real reading, or there's more quote-unquote intellectual things they could be reading that are more educational, she argues that actually it's sometimes even more educational to opt for reading that graphic novel as opposed to the other novel, because if it's more exciting for you to read, it's stimulating your mind more, it's more engaging because it has different layers to interpreting it that may not be there if there are no images. And with like comic panels, the kids are learning cause and effect as they read it. What happened between panel A and panel B? And even as you're older, that concept still holds where you can have more fun with what probably happened between the panels and things like that. So it can teach both basic concepts and more complex introspective. It can trigger more complex introspective thoughts in older people as well. So all ages can enjoy these graphic novels because it can teach lessons about life at a deep level or just be a source of fun. But either way, it teaches life lessons and shows stories in a way that's not patronizing, but is still somehow universally understandable. And we talked about this before in episode 2 again, which is called Cyberdog and Hello Kitty, if you're interested in that. And the second half of that episode talks about Hello Kitty and kawaii culture, and overall the culture of how cartoons can be used as educational tools that really help with soft power and diplomatic relations around the world. So that's why you can't underestimate the power of this stuff to do good in the world, because it is a way for people, no matter what language you speak, to understand a story put before them. And that's how lessons have been taught internationally to really have these maintaining positive ties between countries and things like that. It's sort of like math equations where you can get the message across with these images even if you don't understand the language. So it's a barrierless entry into a world that people from all over the world can dive into. It's a barrierless entry into a universally inclusive world. It's a place where we can all go to, an alternate universe that is inclusive to all. That's a better way of putting it. So as much as Wortham and others have tried over time to cast comics and graphic novels in this negative light, viewed them as glorifying violence and just rotting kids' brains, the research and truly how fandoms talk about what they like about the comics proves otherwise. And so it's so important to not judge a fandom before getting to understand it better, and I wish Wortham had done that. And it is important to keep in mind all of the positives. And of course, there are aspects of comic books that are too much and are a negative impact potentially on kids. But let's make sure we have the evidence to back that up before saying so and before restricting what kids have access to reading. And let's make sure we don't cherry pick those examples when trying to make that claim. Really, there's a lot more good than bad that is coming out of certain comics and what their stories truly say about the world and how they influence people, how these superheroes become role models, and what values they emulate for readers young and old. People who read comics, they're able to make a story their own as they read it, and they learn kind of about cause and effect of what happens. So when you're older, you can have a lot more fun with that and deciphering stories as you see fit and what resonates with you, but the experience of reading can also be personalized and educational for kids as they try to learn cause and effect and understand how one thing led to another, which again can help with understanding the concepts of other cultures and other ways of being, other things happening outside of one's own realm. I hope this has helped you better appreciate and understand the importance of not censoring what we get to read and the comics that we consume. And I personally believe that all literature in any form is valid and worth supporting the reading of. truly don't underestimate the power of comic books and other forms of media to have a good impact, as well as a bad one, but let's be careful how we talk about the bad impact and not overgeneralize it. Thank you for listening, and I will see you for another episode of How to Stand next week.